Hi, and welcome to a new video of this MOOC. In this video, we are going to continue the implementation of our TicTacToe game. If you remember, in the previous video, I've just created the new application, the TicTacToe application. So the next step is to create the game module, that is the module that will encapsulate every component related with the game, and the game component, the component that will render the header of the application of the game and the board of the game. For making the game component available in the application, it's important to importing the game module in the application module and to exporting the game component in the game module. After that, I will include an instance of the game component in application component template, removing the default code that Angular includes in this template. Okay, so I'm going to the terminal in which I have the application I've just created, the TicTacToe, and I'm going to create first of all the module ng-generate module game, and thanks to this command Angular will create a folder, the game folder, and inside this folder the two files needed for the module implementation. Now I'm going to create with ng-generate component the new component inside the game module, so I need to include the folder game and the name of the component, game again, and this will create inside the game folder a new folder with the game components file. I have all these things created, so I'm going to serve the Angular application. What I need to do now is to go to the new application that Angular have created and to check that I have here the game module folder with the two files of the module and the game component folder with the needed files for the component. In the application module, I have to import the module I've just created, game module, that is available inside the game folder. So this is game.module, with this I import it. And I have also to include here in the imports list, game module. Then, as I said before, I have to go to the game module and to export the component I've just created. So I have to include here a new array, the exports array, with the game component I've just created. Now this game component is available to be included in the application template, so I'm going to check the tag that I have to use, application game, and here in the application component template I'm going to remove the default code that Angular creates and include here a new instance of this new component, the application game component. So as you can see now, after including this instance of this new component, I have here in my application the default template of this new game component. The next step consists on creating the header and the board components inside the game module and to include an instance of each of them in the game component. The board component will be empty by now, and the header component will render a fixed string with the turn of a random player. Okay, so I'm going to stop the server and I'm going to create both components. ng-generate component inside the game module always, header that will create the new folder of the header component inside the game folder, and ng-generate component board that will create a new component inside again the game module. I'm going to launch again the server and I'm going to go to the code and see how the new components are here, the board component and the header component. I'm going to include inside game component the two instances that if I go here I see that are application board, and in case of the header, of course, application header, and I'm going to create here inside the game component template an instance of each of them. So I have application header, a new instance of this application header component, and now application board. As I said before, the application board component template, is empty by now, and the application header will render header component here will render a fixed string that indicates turn of player 1, for example, the X. Okay, so if I go to my application, I can see how I have here the header component template and here the board component template instead of the default message or the default template of the game component. Now I'm going to create the square component that renders a button with the default value that detects the click events from the user. Then I will render in the board component template the 9 squares that compose the board of our game. So I'm going to stop again the server in order to generate the new component, always inside game module, okay? In this case is named square. This will create the square folder with the needed files for implementing the component and will update the game module in order to include the new component. I'm going to launch again the server and go to the code in order to implement the logic and the template of this square. In the template of the square, I'm going to include a button that, using a event binding, detects click events of the user and calls a method that is called handle square click, and I'm going to implement it later, and this renders the default value for each square. Now in the logic, I'm going to implement this method that by the moment just shows in the console a message saying that a square has been clicked. But it's very important to know which specific square has been clicked, because we will need to update the state accordingly. So we need to include two properties here, one for the row and another one for the column. That is the way I'm going to use to specify the square that has been clicked. Okay, so I have the row and I have the column. And another important thing is that when the board component renders each square, is this component the one that will pass the value of the row and of the column to each square. So this is a property passed from the parent component, and as you can imagine, I have to annotate them with the input decorator. So I'm going to import the input decorator and to include here the annotation for these properties. Okay. Now I have to go to the board component in order to render the 9 squares that compose the board, but take into account that the value of each specific square will be also retrieved from the state of the application. As I have not yet this state of the application, I'm going to create a property here in the board component, including the default values for the squares. So I'm going to create a private property that is called values, and that is a matrix of strings with the default values for the squares. So I will have 3 rows, and each of these rows will have 3 columns with the default values. Okay, so this is the matrix I'm going to use in order to print the default values of the squares. Now in the templates, using the ng4 directive of Angular, I have to go through the rows and the columns in order to render an square for each position of the matrix. So I'm going to go here to the template and put first a div in order to go through the rows, and then I will print a square for each column in each row. So using the ng4 directive, I go through the rows, let row of values of this private property I just created, and it's important that I need the position, the index in each array. So I will use index as I, and then inside each row I will print the component, the application square component. Okay, so this will go in this case again with the ng4 directive, but in this case through each column inside each row. So let call of row using in this case index as j. And now I have the index of the row and the index of the column for passing it to the input properties I defined in the square component. So I have the row that is the I, and I have the column that is the j. So with this, what I'm doing is to pass to the square component the value of the input properties row and column depending on the position of this matrix. So if I go to the browser, you can see here how Angular has rendered the matrix of the rows. And if I open the console and I click on an square, I see here the message in the console. What I'm going to do now is to go to the square component and to put here the value of the specific row and the specific column in order to see it in the message in the console. And also I'm going to modify the style of the square in order to make each square with the appropriate dimensions. So I'm going to include here a style for every button in the CSS file of the square component with the height to 100 pixels and the width also with 100 pixels. If I go again to the application, as you can see here, I have the squares, and when I click on one square, you can see in the log how the position of the square is indicated in the log. So with these steps, we have implemented the needed code to have the structure of our application ready. In the next video, we will start developing the state of the application. See you there. Bye.